Hello, and welcome to It's Just a Rough Draft, but It's All We've Got, Preserving History Through Newspaper Digitization. I'm Pat Reeks here with Melissa Jerome, and we're happy that you're taking the time to view our session. As the title of the session implies, news is commonly referred to as the first rough draft of history, and newspapers are a critical component of the resources used for research across many disciplines. The dwindling creation and use of microfilm and microfilm readers, the deterioration of existing microfilm, and the transition to born digital news, along with ongoing news industry struggles and the loss of newspaper morgues and archives, all create an urgent need for action. Digitization provides alternatives for not only preserving the important and unique history held in newspapers, it also expands both access and searchability. This session will examine some of the challenges and opportunities related to newspaper digitization projects, and will address both the considerations involved and the processes necessary for a successful project. The session will also focus on some of the ways our experiences at the University of Florida can potentially be emulated and adapted by other organizations looking to jumpstart their own projects. Specifically, we'll look at partnerships and collaborations, working with publishers, funding opportunities, copyright questions, dealing with multilingual content, ensuring equitable and open access, and dealing with born digital content. We'll also review a few of the projects we've done at UF and look how we've successfully completed them using varying approaches. Finally, we'll present a brief checklist of a few things that need to be considered for a successful project. And if there's time, we'll look at the platform that the UF digital collections sit on and talk about some of the search capabilities and other features. Okay, so partnerships and collaborations. As with most projects, creating collaborations and partnerships is a key part of successful digitization work. We actually went quite a while, probably longer than we should have, dealing with projects on more or less an ad hoc basis, as people approached us with questions about specific titles or requests to have something digitized. Not having a structured approach often created confusion and resulted in things getting lost in the shuffle. One point of note, we often have dozens of requests in play at the same time at UF, since we're known statewide for the Florida Digital Newspaper Library, and many organizations consider us the go-to when they have questions or want to get something digitized. We now have a more structured and formalized process to handle inquiries. The contacts still originate from a lot of different places, but they're funneled to a group we jokingly called FAN, Florida Action Newspaper Network, for discussion, determination about how to proceed, deciding on action items, and then responding to the request if it came from an external entity. And Melissa will actually have more detailed information about that process a little bit later on. The group includes faculty and staff from across a number of different departments, including conservation preservation, digital support services, administration, special and area studies, humanities and social sciences, and others. One piece of advice that I'd take away from this section is think big when considering how to move a digitization project forward. I kind of hate to use it, but I think outside the box is probably a pretty accurate way to be thinking about a project when you approach it. Consider all the possibilities. As you'll see later in the presentation, we've successfully completed projects comprised of a broad range of partners in various combinations. That can include funding agencies, private businesses, newspapers and publishing groups, commercial vendors, public libraries, historical societies, individuals, community leaders, and others. One takeaway, it's important to remember that partnerships and collaborations can often involve both external and internal folks. In our case, we have a very large organization, so as you can see from the group I mentioned earlier, it's sometimes challenging to even coordinate among ourselves, much less with multiple outside entities. Okay, working with publishers. This is an area that's really changed over the past 10 years or so. At UF, we've been working with publishers for a long time, since we first started microfilming newspapers literally decades ago, and we moved to digitizing in the early 2000s. As you'd expect, consolidation of the news media has made it more difficult to work with the papers, since many are now owned by corporate investors. We've seen this impact our born digital work as well, which we'll talk a little more about later. Most small papers used to be happy to sign a rights agreement and have somebody else deal with their archives. One of the tricky things now is that even many small local or regional papers are actually no longer locally owned. So even though the perception is that they're local, they're actually part of a syndicate of papers. So a real contrast has developed between how small locally owned papers perceive our work versus how large media conglomerates and syndicates do. So when I'm referring to that, we all know the usual suspects would be Gannett, Tribune Media News Group, Hearst, and that kind of thing, where they've actually bought up a lot of these small sort of rural papers. Some papers think there's an opportunity to monetize older content, which in reality is very rarely successful other than for large national papers or for strong regional or urban papers. So think like New York Times, Washington Post, that kind of thing. But because they have that perspective, they don't want to have someone else archive their historical content, or they want to sign contracts with large vendors such as ProQuest or Newsbank, and then get paid for providing that content. Some also perceive a lot of the value of their historical content as being in the photos within their papers, so they don't want those to be out there freely available either. This creates the conundrum that it's great to have the content available somewhere other than on microfilm, so it's more accessible, but it ends up often putting the content behind a paywall. As a result, part of our motivation for the work we do at UF is driven by the preference to have free and open access to historical news. So talking a little bit more about the funding opportunities. Grants have been our primary funding source for all our larger projects, and we're fortunate to have a strong grants program that has supported our efforts both pre-award and post-award. As you'll see when we take a quick look at some of our projects, the larger ones generally always will require some kind of external funding. Another alternative is local funding or in-kind support of some type from the community where the paper is or was published. That can include historical societies, public libraries, interested community members, community leaders, some of those folks that I mentioned earlier. We actually had a case where the members of the board of a small regional bank were interested in the history of the small town where both the bank and the newspaper originally were located. So the bank came to us and wanted to assist with getting the newspaper digitized, and started with a specific date range that they were interested in. And as we got into the project, they actually got excited enough about the outcome that they came back and ended up funding the full run of the newspaper from beginning to end. We also have a number of public-private examples where we've worked with commercial vendors or with a number of different interested stakeholders. As I mentioned earlier, we're careful about how we do this, and we kind of weigh the positive versus the negative, since in most cases it does restrict access in some way. We participate in a unique international project that we'll talk more about later that has a commercial component, but also includes a large amount of open access as part of the project as well. Another way we've handled projects, generally the smaller ones or papers that we're very interested in having available, is to cover the cost internally. So in those cases, the expenses are just baked into our operating budget. Project goes into our digitizing queue, and we absorb the cost since we have the infrastructure in place to do that on at least a selective basis. Okay, now I'm going to hand it off to Melissa to talk about copyright, multilingual content, and open and equitable access.
Thanks, Pat. So copyright can be tricky to deal with. We're thankful that anything pre-1925 is fairly safe to proceed with, given that we don't have to worry about copyright infringement because anything pre-25 does fall within public domain. So the copyright cutoff date is currently 1925, but this is a moving target, which is great because as time moves on, we'll be able to digitize more content post that year. Our experience is that most individual newspapers don't register copyright. And thankfully that hasn't been a big concern, but we do ensure that we kind of follow this process we have in place to make sure we're doing our due diligence and not potentially getting ourselves in trouble. One concern that we have is copyright versus the right to digitize. So for example, you can have rights because you own a particular item, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you can then turn around and digitize it and make it freely available. So we handle this in a variety of ways. There's been a few times where we've worked with a vendor who may have purchased the rights to a particular paper, for example, and it might still be under copyright. And so access to that paper then is restricted. But oftentimes what we do most is we work with copyright holders. So usually the publisher of the newspaper who grants us permission to digitize and make the content freely available while they still retain copyright. And we have a whole process in place for that. In terms of copyright research and making sure we're doing our due diligence, we do have a process in place that involves adopting copyright research process that was implemented for the National Digital Newspaper Program. And this essentially involves reviewing catalog copyright registration books, which you can see a picture of here on the slide. Most of these are available online through the Internet Archive, so you can more easily search through them. So we look through them to, for mentions of the items. We also review content itself for copyright symbols or any other obvious sign of copyright registration. And then we always consult with our copyright librarian about permissions and right statements. And I think that leads us to our big takeaway here being that you should consult your counsel, make sure that you're seeking legal advice and that you're documenting your copyright research process to make sure that you are keeping track of what it is that you're doing and the decisions that you're making. And then, of course, when appropriate, best way to go would be if you can work with a publisher to have a permissions form signed to grant you permissions to digitize, making sure you're keeping track of those as well. In terms of multilingual content, here at the University of Florida, this is extremely important to us because many of our collection materials are in a language other than English. For newspapers specifically, a lot of our content is actually in Spanish. And so we feel it's extremely important that there be points of access to this content. So thinking subject headings, for example, metadata, anything in our catalog and bibliographic records should be provided in the original language of the works to allow for making the content more discoverable and accessible for patrons who are not English speakers or who are simply looking for content that's written in a language other than English. And so we handle this a little differently depending on how the content is being worked on. Most of our newspaper work is done externally, so we do a lot of digitization work with vendors. And so this process involves reviewing content beforehand and ensuring that we're kind of compiling certain metadata and then working with the vendor so that this content is OCR'd in the original language of the material. But then, an example of that, for example, is on the picture we have here of the St. Croix Avis, for which a good chunk of it was actually published in Danish. And so having to work with the vendor to make sure that was OCR'd correctly. But then internally, we also have a bilingual metadata working group. And as I mentioned before, Spanish is the primary language other than English for our material at the moment. And so we have a bilingual metadata working group that's working to establish essentially a thesaurus of Spanish language subject headings that we can apply to records for our Spanish language materials so that they are more easily discoverable by our patrons. But this does require personnel, language skills, and time. But it is super important and does allow for making more equitable access, which leads me into my next slide. And again, the importance of open access, as Pat has been stressing, this really became evident to us during COVID when folks were unable to travel and visit their libraries to get access to material. So we really try to push to get content open access as much as possible. And some of the implications or value to having open access. One of the things being long-term, right? So having content that is going to be up essentially forever, as long as technology plays well with us. Increasing the visibility of the content, open meaning that folks are more likely to stumble across it than if it's behind a paywall or if it's only available in person. And then also having some research implications. So newspapers being like a really great primary source for use in the classroom, not just in terms of finding, but also teaching the students how to analyze and how to become critical thinkers. It's extremely useful for, studying all sorts of aspects of life, and newspapers really are applicable in all fields of study. And then the last but not least, genealogy as well. We get requests for genealogy related work all the time. Newspapers really are a go-to source for family history. We have an example here of an obituary that was published in one of our papers, but you can find information on, weddings and graduations, and the social columns in the newspapers really are a treasure trove for finding information. So can't stress enough how important open access is. Now I will go back and pass it on to Pat for Born Digital News.
Okay, great. Thanks, Melissa. Yeah, so I mean, there's obviously some parallels between, digitizing the news and Born Digital News. The obvious difference being you're already working with digital files and not microfilm or hard copy paper. So there's obviously there's similarities, but there's also a lot of differences too. And just so everybody is clear, in this context, we mean by Born Digital, we're not talking about harvesting newspaper websites, because there's always so much different in the content, and it's continuously churning and that kind of thing on a website. What we're talking about here are the files that are created to either make a print newspaper or what many papers call an e-edition, which is a mirror of a print paper. Actually, it looks just exactly like the print newspaper. Generally, they make those available online, although in some cases we ingest these files that they've never been used. They were made in the preparation of the hard copy paper, and they're never actually available online. Now, like in our cases, in our local paper here, the Gainesville Sun, they have a print newspaper that they deliver. They have a newspaper website that continually updates all day long. They also then have a link to the e-edition of the website, of the newspaper on their website, so it looks exactly like the newspaper. So just real briefly, just some of the things to consider, because they are a little different than when you're digitizing. So the means of acquisition is the big thing that's going to be different, is how you're actually harvesting the files. We get them all different ways. Some of them, they just make the real small papers, so we'll sometimes make them freely available. Sometimes we'll do an e-subscription. The physical way that we retrieve them sometimes is Dropbox or Google Docs or an FTP server, or they might just actually email us the files. So we get them all different ways. We actually do sign a related kind of a permission form to what we would do if we were digitizing a paper that says, it grants the University of Florida non-exclusive rights to supply internet distributable digital copies. And so we establish that relationship with them as our very first step. One of the things you run into is they don't want their fresh news to be out there available right away. So we often have embargoes. We have embargoes from a week all the way up to a year. And we have it built into our process that, we go ahead and we ingest the files, but if it's a year-long embargo, they don't go up. So they're not publicly available for that year. In some cases, we have an IP restriction where anybody can access the paper, but you have to be either logged onto a UF network or you have to be in a building on campus, one of the libraries on campus, to be able to access it. This is also a place where there's major differences in the large publishers versus the small rural publications. We're running into that same situation of, the bigger publishers aren't interested in having us, pulling in their digital content and archiving it. But the small papers still continue to look at that as a cheap, easy way, and it's free to them for us to archive their news. So we get them in all different formats. If you talk to the folks in our production area, what they really love is to have, combined multi-page PDFs, but in reality, we get them in all different formats, and we're happy to take PDFs or files in whatever way we can get them. And, so we bring them in and then they process them on our end. A lot of free tools out there, New Folder Wizard, and a bunch of things that you can use along with browsers that help to kind of organize them and pull the files together. I think one of the things that's worth noting about doing Born Digital is that there's really actually kind of a lower bar because you're not doing the digitization part. And once you have the partnership set up, and once you have a platform for it to sit on, it actually takes a little bit lower investment of time and staff time and resources than what you might think. So it's a pretty doable thing once you have the process in place. And I'm going to go back to Melissa. She's going to provide more details about our actual process of when we begin a digitization project.
Thanks, Pat. So as Pat mentioned, this is kind of like a workflow for FAN, the internal group that he mentioned earlier. First, one of the things that we consider it as management. So who is going to be the best person or people to handle this request? Which takes into consideration, like, is it going to be an internal project? Is it going to be something that we do externally with a vendor? Who on each end is going to do what? How do we keep track of projects? We currently are using things like Teams and having recurring meetings to kind of keep each other updated, but kind of, deciding what's going to be the best way to manage the ins and outs of the project. We also think it's important to consider how you prioritize requests. So we currently here do a first in, first out, but it really depends on our queue. So we have a spreadsheet where we keep track of these requests that we get externally, though we are considering creating some sort of external facing form that maybe is more accessible. We also can't stress enough too, like ensuring copyright, or, doing a copyright review. Is it something that's out of copyright, or is it in copyright? And are you going to need some sort of permissions form? Funds, again, being one of the more important things too, because money is what makes it work. So if it's a small project, is it something that you can handle internally? Can we just put it into queue? Is it maybe something that could be done with a small donation? Or is it going to be a larger scale project that really is going to take a lot more time and folks to be involved? So would you want to consider essentially maybe applying for a grant to help fund those efforts? And then something else that we think about too is at what point do we circle back to our original list? Because as I mentioned before, we do try to stick to a first in, first out, but that really does rely a lot on staffing and timing, and keeping in mind, for example, we have a time sensitive grant that might push requests back. So having to remember to go back to those and figuring out then, how you make it work. But all of this can't be done really without access to the content, which is key. So at UF, we do have a pretty large repository. We do have extensive holdings of Florida newspapers, but our collection does have gaps. And so we do work with public libraries, for example, or other content holders to essentially work together and digitize our materials. And so we have, for example, a loan agreement in place with the partner whenever we are going to be borrowing material that essentially outlines, how much material, what exactly are we accepting, how long are we accepting it for, and then things like storage and care considerations. Tied to funding, which I mentioned earlier, is cost consideration. So things to keep in mind is the format of the content. Is it on film? Is it paper? If it's paper, is it loose? Is it bound? What are the dimensions? Keeping in mind amount of content, so number of reels or number of pages, so that you can really build a better estimate. Also keeping in mind things like quality of the paper. So is it looking pretty normal? Is it content that maybe is a little more brittle? Is a microphone maybe suffering from vinegar syndrome? And then keeping in mind too, like how many folks do you need to actually, take care of the scanning to sit and be able to do the work? Other information that's helpful to keep in mind too, or do catalog records already exist for these materials? Do they need to be updated maybe? Do you need to have new ones created? We also here, because we do ingest into our own platform, we also create records for that platform. And then another thing to keep in mind as well is if you are working with a partner who's contributing content, what is to be done with that content once it's all done? Does the partner want the content back? Are you keeping it? What exactly is the plan for that material? And from there, over the next few slides, we have about 5-6 minutes left. So we'll try to kind of quickly go through some of these, but we'll show you some of the examples of projects that we've been working on here at the University of Florida Libraries that covers everything from public to private partnerships, small internal projects to large scale grants. and everything again from working on a local, national, and international scale. So these are just a few of the projects that we've worked on, and the ones that are appearing in blue that are hyperlinked do have proposals linked out to them that are available if you want to look at those for more information. The NDMP project, for example, is one where we've worked with international partners to continually digitize newspapers from Florida, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands and make them available online. The Film on the Boat project also has an international partner working with the University of Puerto Rico to digitize historic newspapers from the Caribbean. This one has an interesting backstory because there was once a librarian who would go around and film microfilm on a boat. And so that's always fun to tell. Today's technology for us accessing newspapers it has helped revitalize and enhance our digital collections, as well as to digitize an additional 1.5 million papers or pages from the newspapers. And that one, along with the digitizing Florida newspapers, have been really great too, because they've also allowed for providing statewide training to library personnel on how to access and use FDNL, the portal that it sits on. We've also had a couple of other various projects that we funded in various ways that we kind of built into our queue. And then things like the LARP project, which is funded by CRL, which we've done over the years, but our current is focused on digitizing newspapers from the French Antilles. And I'll pass it on to Pat.
Okay, and I'm going to make really quick work of this because I know we're getting real short on time. And what I'm going to basically just say is all of these projects had some combination of a private partner, in our case, a university, a public partner, a vendor of some sort. And in the Global Press Archive Alliance, people might be familiar with that because it's run by CRL. It was a membership organization and a vendor and participating universities from CRL. And that one, one thing I want to note is that was millions of pages of international newspapers. And of those millions, a really big portion of it was open access. So even though we're in a project that's got things behind a paywall, we also have tens of millions of pages that's being put out there for open access. So that was always real important to us. And I'm going to leave it at that, Melissa, because I know we're getting short.
Yeah. And then a project checklist. So just really quickly to kind of wrap up and summarize everything that we've talked about, some things to kind of leave you thinking about if you are considering a newspaper digitization project. Again, funding, who's going to pay for the content, copyright, what is the status, and do you need permissions? Content, how much exactly is available that you can work with, format tied into that. So again, is it on film, is it paper, what's the condition? Keeping in mind technical aspects, so the metadata and OCR, just as simple quick points, management and workflow, like who's going to be handling the day-to-day, who's doing what part of the digitization project. Are you going to be partnering with anyone? Who are those potential partners? What capacities do they have? And then platform, how is access going to be provided? Is there a long-term plan for archiving, redundancy, sustainability? All important things to think about and keep in mind. And with that, I will say too, I won't have too much time, but we can go through really quickly the platforms that we've kind of been mentioning throughout our presentation: the Florida Digital Newspaper Library, which is where all of our Florida newspaper content lives, and then the Digital Library of the Caribbean, which is the platform where we submit our Caribbean newspaper content that we've digitized. And so just to quickly show you what that looks like, let me pull that up and then share my screen. Here we go. So FDNL, for short, is what we call it. Some of the quick things to show you, to kind of point out as kind of highlights of this platform that are new compared to the old one. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the older platform, but there is a titles page where now you can explore by title set. So you can do a quick search for a publication by title. There is a map now that also allows you to just click on county and see how many papers are in that county. And then it does update the list to show you the papers that are available from that county. There's also the map search, which we did have on the old platform, but it has been updated. So you could like make a square, for example, hit search, and it's going to bring up all the newspaper issues that we have available from that particular area. There's also the dates, and under the advanced search, so if I were to go back home and click advanced search, this is extremely useful for doing research because you can do more of like a complex query. You can type in, for example, the name of a publisher, the name of a paper. You can do a keyword search, and you can also narrow by date all at the same time, which is extremely helpful, especially if you're going to be doing extensive research within the newspaper collections. And then just to show you really quickly, the Digital Library of the Caribbean, or as we call it, DLOC, which again has similar features. So like title sets where you can view a list of all the titles. The search functionalities work the same. So the system is set up in the same fashion. The other neat thing about DLOC is I would mention the collections and partners page, because you could then come search for a specific collection. For example, if I were to type in newspapers, you can see the Caribbean Newspaper Library, where all of the newspaper content sits within this platform. And I think that might put us at time. So I'm going to just share the presentation one last time to just say thanks, and that we'll have time for questions. And Pat and I are both available through email if anyone wants to reach out to us that way as well.
Great. Thanks, Melissa, and thanks everybody for attending.
Thank you all.